This is the Performance People podcast brought to you by our new brand, Ainslie & Ainslie, giving you the sleep, rest and recovery you need when you need it most with our new night powder supplement. Shake and take 1 to 2 hours before bed, sleep like an athlete and wake up different. Now on the pod this week is Jess Thom, Team GB's psychologist. If there's a person who knows how to get an edge with strategic thinking, it's Jess. She's got Olympic-sized tips for resilience that we can all learn from.
What does you at your best look like? And then what are the first steps that you need to take to ensure that you can deliver on that and consistently deliver on that?
And I saw your tips for sort of building Olympic resilience, which I wanted to just dive into a little bit.
Elite athletes don't get success by avoiding things. They get success by approaching and going into it and attacking it head on.
Can you just explain what the internal critic is and then what you do with it?
It's normal to feel angry. What might be driving that? Where's that coming from? So to help them understand it and normalize it for themselves.
And it feels like that would be a really good way of dealing with nerves and pressure.
This is the biggest area that we still haven't properly tapped into and explored. Like physically, we have got as much out of this as we can, but actually psychologically, there is loads more that we can sort of exploit and go after to enhance performance.
Jess, if there's a lady that knows about how to get performance out of various bunches of sporting professionals, you are it. So I'm really pleased that you've joined us on the pod today. Thank you very much for coming on. I guess to all people, I asked them for a moment in time to sort of kick us off. And to you, it's no different. So what do you think? What would you assume that might be in your world?
Well, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me along today. It's great to chat to you. I think when I was thinking about this, there was a couple of different things that stood out, but I think I'm going to hone in on an experience that I had as a trainee psychologist when I was working in a rugby club. And it was a young academy player who was getting really angry, and it was getting him red cards quite consistently in games, which was obviously a bit of a problem. And, you know, the coach came to me at the time, was like, you need to fix this anger and stop him being angry. And I sort of just took that for what it was. And I remember sitting down with him and being like, right, okay, we need to work on this anger for you. And how do we stop you getting angry? And he, unsurprisingly, got very angry at me trying to stop him from being angry. And I look back on that moment and I really cringe, because I now work in a completely different way. And I learned a lot from that, in the sense that anger is a very valid emotion. Actually, it's completely normal to feel angry. And there was probably a very good reason why he was feeling angry. And me trying to tell him that he shouldn't feel angry was just a disaster. And I think that later on in my career, I didn't realize at the time that I got it totally wrong, but later on in my career, I really realized that. And I found a new way of approaching sort of working with athletes and helping them from a psychological point of view that is way more accepting of whatever you're thinking and feeling is okay. And that then allowed me to be, I think, way more successful in the work that I have subsequently done. So I think that's my moment that I still look back on and makes me really uncomfortable and cringe at.
Yeah, but it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's sort of like that question, what would you tell to your younger self? It's the same sort of thing that that occurs when you ask yourself that question. You often do cringe at your former self, and you would have done things differently for sure, with hindsight and experience on your side. But it's interesting, the anger management piece. I suppose let's take that, because anger management, that can happen in all walks of life. Wherever you play at the top of your game, you know, anger management is going to definitely feature, whether you're a sports person or a business professional or whatever. So if you're taking somebody now with anger management issues, how would you address that? How would you deal with that?
Well, I think I would first of all start off by normalizing the fact that they feel angry. As I say, it's a very valid emotion. It can even be a helpful emotion. And I could sort of sit back and and say, okay, it's normal to feel angry. What might be driving that? Where's that coming from? So to help them understand it and normalize it for themselves. And I think the next step of it is actually to help them then choose their response to that feeling of anger. And this is the bit that I think people don't always realize, is that we have full control over how we respond to our thoughts and our feelings, but we don't have full control over our thoughts and our feelings. And so, you know, working with that individual, I would have gone back and sort of said, okay, well, you feel this on the pitch. What's the helpful response to that? What's the unhelpful response to that? And what can facilitate the helpful response, and what is it that's sort of hooking you and pulling you into that unhelpful response that's getting you those red cards. So I think that would be the process that we would work through, but it wouldn't be to attack them for feeling angry and trying to change the fact that they're feeling angry. I'd normalize that.
And I suppose you've got to focus on what they want the outcome to be, right? So what do you want the end goal or the end game to be, and then track back from that?
Exactly. So it's thinking about, okay, what does them playing their best rugby look like? Or in the other example, what does you at your best look like? And then what are the first steps that you need to take to ensure that you can deliver on that and consistently deliver on that? So having that clarity around success for you is essential in that process.
I was interested to read in the prelim and the build-up to the Paris Olympics, there was a lot of press on you about mental strategizing with the Team GB athletes, and how you sort of went about making sure that they were as strong and as powerful internally as they possibly could be for competition and what was going to come next. And there are a few sort of things that play into that. And one of the things that sort of jumped out at me was this internal critic part. Can you just explain what the internal critic is, and then what you do with it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all have that inner voice that sort of sat there telling us we're not good enough, or that we can't do this, or, you know, what if I make a mistake? What if I make silly? And I think, you know, some people might call that your imposter syndrome, or whatever you want to call it. But I think we all have that voice in our head that is unhelpful quite a lot of the time. And that's a super normal thing to experience. But the key thing is that you don't let that dictate what you then do. So I might be worried about making a mistake. Therefore, my initial reaction might be to sort of avoid a situation where I could make a mistake. But elite athletes don't get success by avoiding things. They get success by approaching and going into it and attacking it head on. And so it's about helping them just recognize that voice in their head, recognize when it's being quite loud, and creating the space to then choose their response to it. So one of the techniques that I'll often talk about is give that voice a name. So mine's Frank, my imposter syndrome. So Frank, thank you. I noticed that you're there today. Actually, that's not helpful right now. This is what I'm going to go and focus my energy and my attention on doing right now.
I've got to just ask, why Frank?
Oh, I have no idea, actually. I really like the name Frank as well. So
it's come back into fashion. The name Frank is definitely having a renaissance. I know a few people calling their kids Frank. So it's definitely coming back. So to put it there as an internal critic could be a whole other issue for you moving forward.
But do you know, the other thing that I think with that is that the internal critic isn't all bad. And so maybe this is to soften the blow for the Franks out there. It's really been helpful for me to get to where I am. I needed that internal critic to drive me and push me forward. And so it's recognizing when it's helpful and when it's not helpful. And when it's not helpful, it's you can do one right now, Frank. I need to focus on this.
And do you find it's interesting because we're so much more open as a society now to a psychologist's input, and many sort of sports people over the years have been reticent to sort of embrace that. Some have absolutely, been forward thinking about it, and others are perhaps not so much, or find that it doesn't help them so much. Have you come up against that? Have you seen that sort of evolve over time? People's openness to actually sort of just delve into that and just see if it can give them that extra marginal performance.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been in this game for over 10 years now. And when I started out, there were nowhere near as many job positions available as there are now for sports psychologists. And I think within Olympic sport, it's pretty commonplace, certainly within the UK, to have a sports psychologist. I think professional sport is getting there, but it's probably still lagging a little bit in some areas. But there's been, numerous examples over my career where I have had coaches sort of directly tell me that there is no space for me in that environment as a sports psychologist. And then you bring in the fact that I'm a female sports psychologist, and it's a double whammy of you are not welcome here. But I think that they're starting to recognize actually this is the biggest area that we still haven't properly tapped into and explored. Like physically, we have got as much out of this as we can, but actually psychologically, there is loads more that we can sort of exploit and go after to enhance performance. And I always say it's not 1% game that you can get from working on this. Potentially, it's tens of percents of gains, and actually bang for your buck is pretty good. I would say, I know I'm biased, but investing in that psychological space is going to get you a good return. But at the same time, we don't have a magic wand, so people need to actually do the work and engage in the process to get the output if they want it.
And stepping into that environment and obviously having to deal with people that might not necessarily be 100% invested in what you're saying and what you're preaching. What was it that just made you keep on going? Just keep knocking that door down, knowing that you have got actually something of value to contribute to that process? Because that's really hard work when you've got to keep banging on the door saying, actually, I can help. I'm only trying to help.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think I've become quite thick-skinned over the years, but I think what drives me is like helping people so that they can go and achieve amazing things, and need to play a small part in that. And I think that just kept me getting out of bed, and I might not have been having an impact with 10 people, but if I made a difference for one person, that was enough for me. And I think then I moved into away from professional sport into Olympic sport, where the door is a bit more open and people do buy into it more. So the resistance wasn't there. And I think that really was, really good for me, because I could properly get my teeth into it and refine my skill and my techniques and the way that I work. So now when I've come back into a professional sport environment, I'm way more confident in what I do. And I've also got a bit more credibility to be able to manage challenging people and sort of like, well, take it or leave it. This is it. So you either want to do it or you don't. So I can be a bit more assertive, I think, in that sense.
And word of mouth is probably, the best way for people in your line of work to obviously the recommendation from another. Have you had any particular clients or any particular sports teams where it's been sort of a game changer, where the dial has completely shifted because people have gone, oh my God, Jess really knows what she's doing, and it can help, and look at the data to show it?
Yeah, well, I think that it's hard with something like psychology, because it's not necessarily as easy to measure as, like a getting stronger, for example. But there are things that we can do. And I think that when psychology is done well, it's inputting with an individual, across the team, and across the whole system. And I think that that's where we then start to see the shift towards, okay, we're moving massively in the right direction because we've got these psychological principles in place. But I don't try and hold on to all of those myself. The more people I can get involved in that psychology process, the more effective that we will be as a individual and a team, and a whole system, really. So I think that there's probably numerous examples where I know I've made a difference, but I would feel very uncomfortable taking the credit for that entirely, because it's always a team effort in elite sport, and pretty much all environments. It's always a team effort, so it'd be hard to pinpoint exactly. It was Psych that had the winning hand.
You're very humble. You're being very humble. People often talk about well-being and performance not gelling together, like that not being something that coexists. But why do you think it does? And why do you think that it's, they are synonymous with one another?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was reflecting on this the other day. I think that I think to have sustained high levels of performance, you need well-being. I think that it is impossible for individuals to manage stresses outside and it not start to creep into their sporting career as well. I think that individuals can probably do it for a period of time, but not for a sustained period of time. And I think that's where possibly the confusion has come in the past, because like they'll say, well, he's still able to go and switch on and perform, but actually can he do that week after week, year after year? No. And especially within Olympic sport, where it's 4-year cycles, you need that sustained level of top performance. So I truly do believe that individuals need to be able to manage themselves and have good well-being outside of the sporting environment to then be able to come in with the mental capacity to deal with all the challenges that elite sport brings. And if you've not got that capacity, then you're probably not going to be successful, or as successful as you can be, I should say.
Yeah, and to be as successful as you possibly can be within a sort of a Team GB environment, what you really need is resilience. You need to prepare well, don't you? And you need the resilience to sort of stay the distance, because those are long campaigns, and they're not campaigns which are glamorous. They're really, really hard fought,
Yeah.
aren't they? And largely behind the scenes, as opposed to, that last sort of few weeks where they're very public athletes. But the rest of the time, absolutely not the case. And I saw your
Yeah.
tips for sort of building Olympic resilience, which I wanted to just dive into a little bit. And you talk about mindfulness, you talk about planning and visualization, and also the come down piece, which is kind of interesting. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But if we start with mindfulness, can you just explain to me why that is a top tip for resilience?
Yeah, so I think that when I sort of use the term mindfulness, I use it to help build the skill of being able to stay present and have your attention in the here and the now. And when you are competing, when you are going to be at your best is when you can have that control of your attention and where it is. So that, it sounds like a really simple thing to be able to focus on the right thing at the right time, but actually being able to do that in high pressure environments is really, really challenging. And therefore the mindfulness training that you do helps to build that skill up. And so there's formal mindfulness training you can do through apps that we've got, or there's informal mindfulness training that you can do through sort of brushing your teeth in the morning and really noticing what it feels like to brush your teeth. But what you're doing is you're practicing bringing that attention to the present moment, which then you can then put into the competitive environment of bringing your attention to the here and the now, so that you're focusing on the right things at the right time. So yeah, it's a huge skill. Sounds simple, but it takes a lot of time and effort to develop it so it holds up under pressure.
Okay, what about the planning and the preparation? Because that's another feature of this resilience piece as well. And preparation is so much to do with, a successful outcome if the preparation is there too, isn't it? Why is that so important as well?
Oh, it's hugely important, and I always say you got to plan for the worst and hope for the best. So we will go through planning all sort of eventualities in the build up to a major event. So we will think about obviously planning around like how you want to show up, what you at your best looks like, what are the strategies that you can use to make sure you deliver on that. But then starting to think about, okay, well, what could stop me from doing that? What could go wrong? How are we going to respond to this? Some athletes keep it quite light touch on the what if planning, but some athletes will be really detailed down to, okay, well, what if this happens in my race? How do I want to respond to it? Or, something broad like what happens if, someone within my family gets ill? Do I want to know about it? When do I want to know about it? How do I want to find that out? So we will go into some pretty good detail. But the whole point of that is that if you've talked it through and you've planned it, if it happens in the event, we know how to deal with it. And so it makes it so much easier. So it's less of a blip in your performance, in your competition, because we've planned it and we know that response that we need to roll out, I suppose. But in every single Olympics I've gone to, I've done extensive what if planning. Something always happens that you haven't planned for, but because you've done so much other planning, you probably can figure out what the right answer is moving forwards. And that's where the sort of agility and the psychological flexibility, being able to adapt, is an important skill to have as well.
One of the things I love about sport is that element of surprise, which you can't predict. And I suppose what you want to do is control the controllables, right? So in the actual moment of the sporting contest or competition or whatever you're doing, that you can't predict what surprises may come your way in that sense. But of course, off the field of play, you probably, I suppose that's what you're getting at. You should probably try and control what you can control.
Exactly. Yeah. Control as much as you can, and then recognize something somewhere will go horribly wrong. But we've got the skills and we can deal with it. And I think that's where the confidence and the belief comes in ourselves of whatever comes my way, I will cope. I will be fine.
Now, the visualization one's an interesting one, isn't it? Because I mean, that is something that athletes talk about more and more frequently now, that they are, closing their eyes and imagining what that race might look like from start to finish. Have you worked with athletes that regularly do that? And what have you seen in terms of the impact that can have on the outcome?
Yeah, so visualization is a really powerful tool. So we know from the research that sort of visualizing something fires the same neural pathways in the brain as you physically actually doing the same thing. So it's a really nice strategy to help you rehearse what you're about to go and do. But what people don't often realize is that it's a skill, and it's quite hard to do it well. And the importance around doing it well and doing it right comes from, if you visualize the wrong thing, you actually increase the chance of the wrong thing happening. So athletes have to really learn how to visualize in the same sort of speed that they would compete at, the same sort of feelings that they would experience, and that, as I say, is quite a skill. So
So how do you
like a
do that?
training process.
Just break down for us how you actually do that. How do you learn to visualize properly?
Yeah, so you start really small, basically. So teach the principles of visualization and start really small of, okay, well, we might visualize cutting a lemon open in your kitchen and what that would feel like, what sensations you would have in your mouth when, you start to salivate, when you get that sour lemon smell. And then we would slowly build it up to, okay, we'll do a simple pass that you might make in your football game, for example, and what does that look like, what does that feel like, to then being able to build it up to, okay, a whole free kick scenario, or a whole race scenario, or moments in time. But the other thing that we can use it for, which is quite effective, is like, if you've seen the competition venue, and you can probably watch previous events where you've seen the massive crowd, and actually just sort of visualize yourself walking out into that environment, noticing all the sensations of that you might feel, of that, anticipation, nerves, excitement, whatever it might be, surrounded by all that noise, that crowd. You might visualize, if you're the swimmer, you might visualize the massive French crowd screaming for their athlete, and you're stood next to them, and what that would be like, and how you want to manage that in that moment. So you can use it from a skill point of view, and also just like a moment of, okay, this is a big event. What would I feel? What would that look like, feel like for me?
And it feels like that would be a really good way of dealing with nerves and pressure.
Yeah, it can absolutely be helpful, because it starts to prepare you for it. So again, if we're thinking about that planning piece, like, if I feel like I've experienced it before and I know what to do, I've practiced doing my response to it, I'll be more likely to be able to go and do that when I actually experience it. So it is a really good way of managing those nerves and those feelings. But I would say it's an important bit, but it's not the only. You can't just do that and it will be fine. I think that there's a load
Damn
of
it.
other skills that come into it as well. But like I think I've said previously, I would, if I was going into an interview, I would start to like sort of go through in my mind what that would look like, how I want to come across, what if they ask me a difficult question, what would that feel like, visualizing myself responding confidently, etc., etc. So I do think that there is a place for it, but do it properly and with some other sort of mental skills, I suppose.
Okay, so how to be an Olympic resilient athlete. You've got the mindfulness, you've got the planning and preparation, you've got the visualization. And then this is the bit that I think is really interesting, because being married to a professional sportsman, I'm quite exposed to how this can look. The performance come down, the decompression
Yes.
bit. That is really interesting, because I think people assume that if you win a medal, or if you win a race,
Mm.
or if you're, if you're absolutely performing to the best of your abilities, that always has a positive outcome days, weeks, months later. Actually, that it can be very different to that, can't it? Can you just explain what the thinking is behind the performance come down and the performance decompression piece?
Yeah, I think this is an area that we've got much better over the last sort of 2 Olympic cycles at, because the post-Olympic blues are real, and you would have experienced this yourself, Georgie, with Ben. But it's really difficult after a major event, because you spend so long planning for that event, and you don't spend, probably, I would say some athletes spend zero time planning for after the event. And you think that maybe you win a medal and that's going to change your life. And the reality is often it does not. So the come down is quite challenging for athletes. And I think this is where we've brought in the performance decompression that's been really successful in helping mitigate that come down a little bit. So there's different phases to it. So in the competition event, venue would do the hot debrief. So that would just be quickly chatting through the thoughts and the feelings there and then. Then you go through a period of what we call time zero, and we'd have this sort of a minimum of 2 weeks where you just get out of that sporting environment, go back into normal sort of life, reconnect with your friends, your family, reconnect with the real world, because the Olympic Games is not the real world. And then also allow yourself allow yourself to feel all the different emotions that you will have. So we call that sort of ride the wave. Recognize that some days you'll feel great and other days you'll feel horrendous, but that is normal and that is okay. And sometimes just knowing that it's normal and expecting to feel that way makes it a little bit easier when you do feel that way. So we recommend that for a minimum of 2 weeks. Often we would do that for longer if we can, a month or two, if possible. And then we have like a process the emotion conversation, where we sit down and actually relive all the key moments, the highs, the lows, and the good, the bad, the ugly, and start to then process the thoughts and feelings that are linked with those key moments, drawing out any strengths that an individual used and thinking about, okay, well, what's the important next steps for me moving forward? And I think that it's that brings a bit of closure to the experience and helps them see the experience for more than the initial feeling that they might have been left with, which might be disappointment or excitement that then doesn't last. So the processing of it is really effective at helping them people get back on track and reset quicker for whatever it is that they're going on to do next.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, sort of, how problematic is that? I mean, you've worked with a lot of Team GB athletes. I mean, some people will be, will find it easier to brush off, the competition than others. And also, I guess some will be reacting in a way that isn't predictable. So, for instance, if they won a gold, again, they still can have these sorts of feelings. If an athlete comes fourth, which is obviously as harsh as it can possibly get at the Olympic Games, and they don't end up medaling, that is another sort of a set of feelings that can also be conjured up. Have you found that there's a particular way that's universal in dealing with this, or is it just very, very individual?
Oh, it's totally individual. I think there's a whole host of factors that come into it. It depends whether that was your first Olympics or your last Olympics. I think
Yeah.
that's an important sort of differentiation as well. But it is quite individual. And, I was just working with an athlete the other day. It was her second Olympic Games, and she was maybe more disappointed with her performance this Olympic Games, but she recovered much quicker because of her experience after the first one, and knowing that it would get better, and also the fact that we had planned for it. So we planned that back end period. And so I think that an individual's response might be unique to them, but I think the universal bit that's important to do is the planning piece around what does that 3 months, 6 months, year after the games look like for you, and being proactive and putting the support touch points in place for them so that they can navigate whatever that individual experience is post games for them.
Yeah, and it's one of those strange things, isn't it? But it's like the extreme highs, and then it can be sort of extreme lows. And it's that teamwork and togetherness that the Olympic brings you. We've just come off the back of our America's Cup campaign, and you're just in each other's lives in a way that it's family more than anything else. And then suddenly you're not, and all that goes.
Yeah.
And it's sort of navigating, like you say, going back into a different world, which is still very much your own, but just finding a way to sort of park that one experience and take the best bits from it, and sometimes the worst, so you can learn and move forward, but also sort of appreciating that there's a world outside of that small microcosm. It's very, very tricky to do. And I guess one of the things that athletes struggle a lot with is the what next question, which isn't just post-Olympic Games, but it might be sort of a secondary career or whatever that is. Have you noticed that in athletes, this sort of what's next question needs to be addressed in all sorts of ways?
Yeah, absolutely. And we always say don't rush to make that decision, because you might be in an emotional place, and that's not a good foundation to make any big life decision like what's next for you. But I think, again, what we've got really good at in the last couple of cycles, is athletes having dual careers, so helping them to plan for their future whilst they are still competing, and not waiting to the end of their career to suddenly go, okay, now what do I want to do next? So hopefully that makes it a little bit easier for them, that they will have degrees or education or have training in something, or have started to have conversations with people around getting work experience, etc., so that again, it's sort of planned for before the end comes. And I think that, again, when you do that planning ahead of time, it makes the transition piece a lot easier for them.
Just a final question then to wrap things up, Jess. What would you say is the single biggest performance lesson from Olympic Games, and from being sort of in the mix of that as the psychologist? What's the biggest takeaway for people that are in sort of any performance work of life?
Oof. That's a very good question. Gosh, okay.
With not an easy answer.
No. What is... I'll give 2. I'm allowed 2?
Go for it. You can have 2, because it's
okay.
you. It's fine.
So I would say, first of all, that plan as much as you can. Plan for what success looks like for you, how you're going to manage yourself to get the best out of yourself in that moment. But also the second bit there is that when you're in it, expect a bit of a roller coaster. Expect to feel a whole different host of emotions and have uncomfortable thoughts, and recognize that's normal, and you still have the ability to choose how you respond to that, which is in line with you being that successful athlete who you want to be, or that successful person that you want to be.
See, it all comes back to controlling the controllables. Jess, thank you so much for coming on. It'd be really lovely to speak to you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Georgie. I really enjoyed that.
Join us for the Performance People podcast every week for the highs, lows, lessons and stories from people like this lot. Michael Johnson.
Some days what I would see is a person who is a shell of what I used to be.
Eddie Hearn.
We don't operate in a business that's dangerous, but we just operate in one where you've got to sleep with one eye open.
Mo Farah.
It couldn't get any harder than what I've gone through, and at that point I just went for it.
Paula Radcliffe.
You can only control yourself.
Susie Wolf.
And Toto did once liken me to a donkey.
Every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.